myths and legends. Now, in this session, we'll be dealing with the various myths and legends. Now, one of the most influencing myths or legends that have greatly influenced the mind and literature of Europe is the legend of King Arthur. And you realize that due to certain cultural intermingling in Europe, this Arthurian story, it developed into a full-fledged legend with emphasis on this noble kingdom called Camelot, on this wonderful king called Arthur, his knights of the Round Table, the queen Guinevere, who has an affair with the knight Lancelot. There are other interesting characters like King Arthur's nephew or son, because there are different versions of it, where Mordred is actually his nephew. In other works, he is referred to as his son. There are various, interpretations. There are, I would say, versions of the same story. But what is interesting is that King Arthur is a medieval mythological figure, and there may not be a real Arthur, but nevertheless, the story, the idea of King Arthur, what he represents, his knights of the Round Table, have always influenced the mind and literature of Europe. Now, in Britain, of course, King Arthur and his knights are part of the Celtic mythology. And when these Celts, they were forced to flee during the Anglo-Saxon invasion, they had to flee. They had to settle in Armorica in France. And when they fled to Armorica, they carried with them not just their literature, they carried along with them these stories, these myths, these legends, and all these they kind of became part of legends in other European countries as well, but with slight variations. And you find writers like Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur popularized Arthur for and made it very popular in Britain. And there are other writers, other poets like Edmund Spenser, Lord Tennyson, who have always been inspired, he's been enamored by Arthur. Now, Tennyson's Idylls of the King is all about King Arthur. And these myths have been reread, reinterpreted, and reworked in several other works as well. For example, in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, now this particular poem, it captures, I wouldn't say it is directly linked to the figure of King Arthur, but again, there is reference to the myth of the Holy Grail. The purest of Arthur's knights, that is Sir Percival, he is the one who actually goes and search the Holy Grail, because he is the only one who is, the purest. He alone has the power to seek the Holy Grail because he is pure of heart. And you find Eliot, he bemoans the condition of the modern world, because the modern world is devoid of purity. It is, I would say, it is a wasteland. It is not just, it's a spiritual wasteland. And you find the symbols of Arthurian legends are kept alive in various works of literature. Merlin is believed to be uh, the most powerful wizard, and it is believed that he is not only a wonderful wizard, but he is also Arthur's, I would have to say, a confidant, advisor, as well as a sort of a father figure to Arthur. Now, his depictions it does vary, because Geoffrey of Monmouth, he kind of combines the story of Meredith, who's actually a North Brythonic prophet and madman, and there is no absolute connection to King Arthur, with the tales of the Romano-British war leader Ambrosius Aurelius, to form a sort of a composite figure which he called Merlinus Ambrosius. The next interesting character I would like to introduce is the character of Lancelot. Now, Lancelot, as you can see, is one of his favorite knights. Lancelot is considered to be one of Arthur's bravest knights. He is the embodiment of chivalry. He is a gentleman, he's brave, he's handsome, and a whole lot of adjectives that go along. And there is one particular mention of this particular character in Tennyson's Lady of Shalott. Now, it's a wonderful poem. You hear about this lady who is, she's kept in a tower, and she is not allowed to. There is a curse, and she cannot look out. But when she sees Lancelot, as he rides past, she is captivated by his reflection. And then she forgets about the curse. And then she leaves her loom because she's supposed to be right next to her loom, not leave the loom. And she leaves the loom just to see him and not just its reflection in the river. So she leaves the tower, she leaves the loom, and then after seeing him, she just dies. And the strange part is that Lancelot is one among the many who arrive and witness. They He actually sees her dead body and wonders what would have caused her death without knowing that he himself is the reason. So he is portrayed as very attractive, and very strangely in your textbook it mentions that he is attractive to men as well as women. And he is the lover of Arthur's queen. Now this is where things get a bit complicated. So there is a sort of a love triangle there. So he is also portrayed as the lover of Arthur's queen Guinevere. Now the other important knights are Sir Gawain as well as Percival or Galahad. Now, Gawain and the Green Knight is one of the most famous ballad, and in this particular ballad, Gawain is the hero. It tells the story of this adventures that he undertakes as he's making his way to the castle of the Green Knight, because he has made a promise to the Green Knight, and he has to withstand a lot of temptations. He overcomes it, but there is this one temptation which he is not able to withstand, and that is he keeps with him the garter that is given to him by the wife of the Lord. But even the slight I would say temptation which he succumbs to. He is punished for that small deception. And when he goes, I mean, he's very frank about it. He goes back to the court and he tells everyone the story. And all his knights, they're all more or less like brothers. They all begin to wear the garter as a mark of affection for Sir Gawain. So now you can see how strong their affection is. Uh, they're all like brothers, all the knights. Now Percival or Galahad, he's also known as Parsifal. Now he's known as the purest of knights. He's very brave, and there is absolutely no comparison uh, when you compare him with all the other knights, and that is one of the reasons. It is because he's pure of heart that he goes on a crusade. He goes in search of the Holy Grail. And what exactly is the Holy Grail? It is a chalice or the goblet that Jesus uses at his Last Supper. And again, the Holy Grail is more or less a sort of a metaphor for man's eternal quest for God. Now, this is Guinevere. As you can see, she's very beautiful. She is the wife of Arthur. She's represented as soldier. She's represented as a warrior. So there are different versions of what sort of a queen Guinevere was. She's forced to marry Arthur, but then she falls in love with Sir Lancelot. Um, and it is Mordred, Arthur's nephew, who actually tells Arthur about this love affair between Arthur's best friend Sir Lancelot and his own wife, the Queen. And when Lancelot hears about it, he fears for his life. He runs away. Guinevere is imprisoned and she is sentenced to be burnt. But then finally, she is rescued by Lancelot and set free. And then there are various versions. In some stories, you find that she kind of she runs away to a convent. How Mordred becomes traitor because he wants to get the throne for himself. But then finally, Mordred is killed, Arthur is wounded, and he's taken to Avalon where he dies. Now, Mordred is presented as a villainous knight, but we believe there are two claims. One is that he's said to be the son of Arthur's half sister, Morgane Le Fay. Some writers believe that or claim that he was Arthur's own son, born out of a sort of an incestuous relationship between Arthur and his half sister. So, because he was born unnaturally, but these are all justifications of sort as to why Mordred turned out to be such an evil sort of a person. Mordred has, hate for Arthur, and he waits for the right opportunity to kill Arthur. And the moment comes when he realizes or when he learns of the affair of Arthur, Arthur's wife with Arthur's right hand man, that is Sir Lancelot. And in a weak moment, he does reveal the same to the king. Matters really turn bad for Mordred when he sets his sights on the queen when the king is fighting away. So then there is this final battle where Mordred is killed, and of course you find Arthur is wounded as well. So Mordred is never pictured as someone who deserves sympathy. He is always seen as someone who betrays. His name is synonymous with treachery, unnatural life. There is nothing positive about Mordred or how he is represented in any of the tales, for that matter. The next important, I can't call this a character, but symbol is the sword. The sword, the magical sword, Excalibur, is something that you'll all have to remember. This is the magnificent magical sword. It is the symbol of sovereign power. In most of the stories, Excalibur is, it's not a simple, it's not an ordinary sword. It is a magical sword which bestows its owners with magical supreme power. And only a true, it's almost like the Thor's hammer. Only, someone who is worthy can handle that sword, and it is actually embedded in a huge stone, and it is Arthur who pulls it out of stone. Nobody has been able to pull out this sword from the stone. It is only Arthur who is able to pull this sword out of the stone, and that tells everyone that he is a true king or he deserves to be a king. And it's his way of fulfilling the prophecy, which is written on stone, by the way. And he's identified and he's crowned as the king. So there are a lot of novels and there are a lot of films based on the legendary sword. The round table, as the name suggests, it's round, and it is symbolic of equality, and there is no head. So everybody who sits there is of equal status. Now, the symbolism of the table, it has, developed over time. It has changed, and it basically represents the chivalric order in the court of kings. Now, this, as you can see, is the fabled famous castle and court which is associated with King Arthur. Camelot is one of the most fantastic capital of Arthur's realm, and it is a symbol of his world, and it cannot actually be located anywhere. So this is a towered Camelot which is described by writers and poets. Now, the towered Camelot is described by Tennyson. And another legend that is entered into the British psyche is the Irish romance of Tristan and Isolde. Now, it's also available as a movie. If you want, you can watch it. Now, it is a story about the Cornish knight Tristan and the Irish princess Isolde or Iseult. Now, their story resembles Lancelot and Queen Genovese's love affair, love story. It is a forbidden love, and this has had a great impact on Western art and literature. Now, it is based upon the story that Richard Wagner has built this opera. It has the same name as well. Mythical creatures have always, inspired us, have always mesmerized us. Now, the British are no different. The island that makes up have a very rich story house of tales that are people by supernatural creatures. So it is not very surprising that there are stories of fantasy and magic. It really goes well with the British. Now you just have to take a look at famous movies and works, novels like J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Rowling's Harry Potter series, as well as C.S. Lewis' Chronicles of Narnia. I'm sure you've read all these, and that is exactly the reason why they're atop the bestseller list. Now, it is this belief in the supernatural that has always been part of the British psyche, and it makes its presence felt through the customs and practices followed by people. Now, if you look at the superstitions, there is this fear of number 13. Number 13 is always thought of something, as unlucky. There are a lot of movies where you have hotel rooms which have number 13, and there are sinister things that happen. Now there is this another superstition about hiding a fallen milk tooth under the pillow for the tooth fairy. The story goes, if you have a milk tooth, that you after you pull out a milk tooth, you hide it under the pillow, and the tooth fairy would take it to her tooth fairy realm and leave behind some token. It could be a pound, it could be a shilling, it could be anything. And there is also this superstition about your bad luck. If you spill salt, you're supposed to throw salt over your left shoulder. It is to ward off evil eye. And then, of course, the most famous and something that all of us would have encountered at some point if you have watched rom-coms, and that is the idea about brides having to wear something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. So each bride would have an assortment of things which would be symbolic of something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, and a silver sixpence in the shoe. Now, it's supposed to, bring good luck, prosperity for the married life. So these are some of the customs that have originated from this some sort of fear of supernatural. Now, now there are also other supernatural characters like Puck and Ariel, Oberon, and Titania in Shakespeare's play like Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, here in this particular play of Shakespeare, which is just these plays were extremely popular during the Elizabethan era. It talks about supernatural creatures like fairies and goblins and whatnot. Now, Oberon and Titania, as you can see in the picture, um, this is Titania. She is the queen of fairies. And then you have Oberon. He is the king of fairies. And then you have a little elf. His name is Puck. And so you have a lot of aerial again features in the Tempest. Now, so these are all the supernatural creatures, and you find that uh, they play an extremely important role in literature, because you find them in Shakespeare's play, not just in Shakespeare's play. If you have, as a young child, if you have read come across Enid Blyton's works, like the book I've shown, you would definitely come to know about all these supernatural creatures. And now, if you're thinking about mythical creatures, if you are obsessed, or if you are um, interested, you'll also hear about the creatures like the Loch Ness monster, the three-headed dog, which featured in Harry Potter. So all these are, some of the many other world creatures that you can uh, see. Now, coming to pixies. Now, pixies are mythical creatures of folklore, and they're supposed to be found in very specific areas like Devonshire or Cornwall. And as these were the haunts of the Celtic tribes, they believe that pixies are basically of Celtic origin, and these creatures are usually depicted as creatures wearing green outfit, wearing pointed hats, also having pointed ears, by the way. They are also fairies, but it is a term that is first used by Edmund Spenser. And before mid 19th century, pixies and fairies were taken very seriously by people because they were quite superstitious. Now, books devoted to homely beliefs of peasantries are filled with incidents of pixie manifestations. It's almost like we have we believe that there is. I I would have to revert to the mother tongue and use the word chatan. We believe when things don't really happen our way, when things go topsy turvy, things fall apart. Um, you have vessels falling off, instantly attributed to naughty, evil spirits. And in this case, it can only be pixies, because pixies are capable of such misdoings. And most Victorian poets saw them as magical creatures. They are like in between people, because they are neither people, they are neither creatures. So they are neither cursed nor blessed by God. And what they do is they do something that is unexpected. They bless the land, and they are also forest creatures. They love humans, and they always remain young. They are winged, and they always fly from one place to another. So they always remain ageless. They never grow old. So this is what pixies basically are. Now, elves again, pixies and elves, as well as goblins. Most of these creatures are pictured as having pointed ears. Now, elves are seen as magical creatures of Germanic origin, and they are thought of as a race. They're semi-divine. Uh, I believe a step above pixies. If pixies are considered to be mischievous and troublemakers, elves are seen as more or less as something more divine. They were later picturized as persons of diminutive size, kind of short. But in the age of romanticism, they were restored to the normal size. And ever since Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, we believe that elves look quite different from what they were or how they were portrayed in works of Enid Blyton. Now, these are the giants. Giants are creatures found in Norse mythology. They look like humans, but they are huge. They are pretty large. They are very powerful creatures, and they are usually associated with chaos, and they are embodied as rather wild and ill-mannered. They are, frequently in conflict with the gods, and fairy tales like Jack and the Beanstalk, and of course, fairy tales like even Tolkien's Lord of the Rings as well as Harry Potter don't really portray giants in a positive light, because giants are represented as beings that would actually eat human beings, particularly children. Next comes the boogeyman. So the boogeyman again is a legendary, scary monster, and it's something that I believe was used as a means of controlling children. It was, a way to scare children. So it is not, the boogeyman does not really have any specific appearance as such. So it's an embodiment of terror, and basically bogeyman is I believe a sort of a trick used by parents to scare the children and make sure they obey them. Next comes the ogres. Again, ogre is, I believe, something that we've all come across if you have seen Harry Potter. I believe it is in the very first series. You find ogres are represented as rather large, maybe stupid at times, hideous creatures. They suppose they appear in many of these classical works of literature. Next comes goblins and dwarfs. Goblins, again, you would have seen in Harry Potter. They are very evil, very tricky, mischievous, cunning creatures, and they are always portrayed as having very unpredictable, temperaments with various abilities. Basically, someone who you cannot really rely on. Now, dwarfs. Now, dwarves are creatures who, frequent the bowls of the earth, and they are expert miners. They are at times, compared with goblins, but dwarves are, in a way, less harmful than goblins. Goblins are always portrayed as having rather nasty temper. Now, dwarves, of course, from I believe fairy tales like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Uh, Dwarves are depicted as having, I believe, human emotions. They're portrayed as being sensitive creatures. Uh, so these are some of the supernatural elements that have been mentioned in the text. Next, we move on to nursery rhymes. Now, there isn't a single child who would not have come across, who would not have learned nursery rhymes like Twinkle Twinkle. But none of us realize that most of the nursery rhymes that we have learned, we have come to adore, these rhymes have some sort of historical background. Now, these rhymes have been sung by most of us, all of us, at some point or the other. And it's not just children of Great Britain, but all the colonies. But all the colonies of the British Empire have come to understand, learn, and appreciate these nursery rhymes. But what we fail to understand is the true meaning or the historical background of some of these nursery rhymes. For example, when children energetically sing Ring of Roses and fall down at the last step of the song, neither they nor their teachers actually realize that this song is actually, words that actually refer to the dreaded Black Death. Black Death, which killed people. One third of the population was brought down by this plague. And this particular song actually refers to the Black Death. But when we play or when we sing the song, we do not pay attention. Now, another such a nursery rhyme would be Mary, Mary, quite contrary. Now, you can read these lines. How does your garden grow? With silver bells cockle shells and pretty maids all in a row, and pretty maids all in a row, Mary, Mary, quite contrary. Now, it is believed that this nursery rhyme was actually, a summing up of Mary Tudor, Queen of England's reign, because she was very different from her father, because she tried to re-establish Catholicism in England. And the pretty maids all in a row refers to actually the persecution of all the Protestants in England, because she was trying to re-establish Catholicism. Now, there is also this belief that the Mary in the rhyme actually could be Mary, the Queen of Scots. None of the nursery rhymes that we hear are innocent. The next nursery rhyme is about the little blue boy. Now, here the little blue boy who has come to blow the horn is none other than Cardinal Wolsey. Now, he was the son of butcher, and it just so happens he was supposed to be someone very arrogant. He's someone who would like to, he talks about himself, or he likes to blow his own horn, and he was very unpopular among English people. And he got the title boy because he obtained his Bachelor of Arts degree when he was only 15 years old. Little Jack Horner, who put his thumb in the Christmas pie and pulls out plums, is said to refer to Richard Whitting, the steward of Abbot of Glastonbury. Now, what he did was he actually he discovered the title deeds of the abbey hidden in the pie. So now this particular rhyme, little Jack Horner sat in a corner eating a mince meat pie. He stuck in his thumb and pulled out a plum and said, "What a good boy am I," actually refers to this particular steward. Now I'm going to skip to the next interesting nursery rhyme, and that is Jack and Jill. Now this is one of the, I believe, most popular nursery rhymes, something that every single child would learn and would appreciate. But what we fail to realize is that this particular nursery rhyme has its historical significance. Now, in one version, this particular nursery rhyme could refer to Cardinal Wolsey and one of his bishops who tried to kind of arrange marriage between Mary Tudor and the French king. But then the whole thing did not really happen. So it kind of came down. Everything came tumbling down. Now, this could also refer to the beheading of Louis XVI and his wife Mary Antoinette. So, because they were beheaded, broke their crowns actually does make sense there. So, it could refer to that as well, the beheading of Louis the 16th as well as his wife Marie Antoinette. So, it could refer to both those people. Now, there is also another idea that Jack and Jill could be referring to the value of currency, which kind of went up and then came down. So there are a whole lot of ideas as to the true meaning behind nursery. Now, this is another nursery rhyme which all of us would have learned. It is Ding Dong Bell, Pussy in the Well. But we do not realize how sinister it is, because Ding Dong Bell actually refers to a very, I believe, a sinister medieval English practice of actually ducking a person in village pond just because of their loose and immoral behavior. And the word pussy actually refers to a woman of loose morals. So if anybody lacks, has moral or shows moral venality, they are actually punished, and the bell is actually rung. The village church bell is rung to call the villagers to witness this practice of shaming the culprits. So this phrase "ding dong bell" is actually used by Shakespeare also in several of his plays. And the next nursery rhyme is "Pussycat, Pussycat," and this, I believe, it's sort of a propaganda. This particular nursery rhyme was used to convey the idea that London is a sort of a prosperous, well-to-do capital, and it would kind of fill people with a desire to visit this capital city. Now, the queen that is being referred to, obviously or undoubtedly, is Queen Elizabeth. You have the other nursery rhymes like Hickory Dickory Dock and One Two Buckle My Shoe. All these nursery rhymes are used as some sort of technique to help students learn, young children learn counting. So it helps, it is used as a counting song. Now, these are the very strange but interesting customs, traditions, myths, and legends of the English people.